Every year, parents called every man I dated, told them I had a virus. I was in therapy for months. Dad texted me, "Marry my friend's son or we won't stop." When they tried it again, what I did next, nobody could believe. My name is Lena Runningwater, my mother's daughter, my father's disappointment, and, as I would eventually discover, is my grandmother's greatest plan. I am 31-year-old, and this is the story of how my parents tried to destroy every chance I had at love, at life, at autonomy, and how, without intending to, they handed me the most powerful weapon I would ever possess. I need you to understand something before we go any further. I need you to understand what it feels like to sit across from a therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Patricia Morales, who kept a small turquoise stone on her desk and never once looked at me with pity, and describe how a man you loved, a man who held your hand at your cousin's wedding and talked about maybe someday adopting a dog together, called you on a Tuesday evening and said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be gentle, "I heard something about you, Lena. I think we should take a break." And when you ask him what he heard, he goes quiet. And when you ask him again, he says, "Your family called me. Your dad." The first time it happened, I was 24. His name was Marcus. He was Dene, like me, are from the To'ahidliini clan, and he worked as a surveyor for the tribal government. We had been dating for 3 months. 3 months of early mornings drinking coffee on his porch and watching the sun come up over the canyon rim. 3 months of him teaching me to identify birds by their songs, of me teaching him the names my grandmother had given to every plant that grew near her house. 3 months of feeling, for the first time in my adult life, like I was a full person that someone was choosing deliberately. My father called Marcus and told him I had herpes. That was the specific lie. Not something vague or complicated. A specific, medical, devastating lie delivered in my father's calm, authoritative voice, the same voice he used when he was negotiating grazing rights or speaking at community meetings. A voice that people trusted. Marcus didn't break up with me immediately. He texted me, and I could feel the discomfort radiating off the message even through the phone screen. He said he thought we should have a conversation. We had the conversation. I told him it wasn't true. He said he wasn't sure what to believe. 2 weeks later, he stopped returning my calls. I didn't know then that my father had made that call. I didn't know until the 3rd time it happened, 2 years later, with a man named Cody, who was brave enough and angry enough to actually tell me what he'd been told and who had told him. By then, the damage to Marcus was long done, and I had spent the intervening years wondering, quietly and destructively, what was wrong with me? Why I kept pushing people away? Why relationships seemed to dissolve around me like morning frost? The second man was named Jerome. He was an artist who lived in Gallup and made jewelry that sold in galleries as far away as Santa Fe. We had been together for 4 months when he simply stopped responding to my messages. I later found out through a mutual friend that he had received a call from a woman claiming to be my aunt. It was my mother, who told him that I had a history of lying to men about my sexual health, that I was manipulative, that he should protect himself. He believed her. Of course he believed her. Why would a woman's mother lie about her? I want to pause here for a moment and ask you to sit with what I am describing, because I know that some of you listening to this are thinking, this can't be real. Parents don't do this. Not to their own child. Not systematically, repeatedly, deliberately. And I understand why you might think that. Because I spent years thinking the same thing. I spent years constructing alternative explanations. My father had misunderstood something. My mother was trying to protect me in a misguided way. There was some cultural context I was failing to account for. Some reason, some justification, some framework that would make sense of what was happening to me. There wasn't one. Sometimes cruelty is just cruelty. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you have decided, for reasons rooted in their own fear and need for control, that they will instead dismantle you. Piece by piece, relationship by relationship, year by year. What they wanted was simple. They wanted me home. They wanted me compliant. They wanted me to marry a man of their choosing, a man who would keep me close, keep me controllable. Keep me within the network of obligation and dependency they had spent my entire childhood constructing. They had someone specific in mind, the son of my father's oldest friend, a man named Dale Whitehorse who was 10 years older than me, who drank steadily and quietly in a way that everyone acknowledged but no one named, and who would have required a wife to manage his household, his image, and his relationship with his own family's expectations. I was supposed to be that wife. I had always been supposed to be that wife. And every time I demonstrated that I might choose differently, that I might build my own life with a person of my own selection, they deployed their particular weapon, the phone call, the voice of authority, the specific medical reputation-destroying lie. When Cody told me what had happened, we were sitting in his truck outside a diner in Farmington. He was looking at the steering wheel instead of at me, and his voice was very careful. Something shifted in me. Not broke. Shifted. Like a tectonic plate, slow and massive and ultimately unstoppable. I went home that night to the small apartment I rented in Shiprock, and I sat on my kitchen floor and I called my grandmother. Her name was Evelyn Runningwater, though everyone in our family called her Shimasani, and she was 78 years old at the time. Living alone in the house her own mother had built on a small plot of land about 12 miles outside of Tsile. She had outlived one husband and refused to discuss a second. She raised sheep for a while, then stopped when her knees made it impractical. She wove rugs that took months and sold for more than most people in our family made in a year. She was the quietest, fierce person I have ever known, and when I called her that night and told her, through a voice that was trying very hard not to fall apart, what I had just learned, that this had happened at least 3 times, that my father and mother had been systematically contacting the men in my life and destroying those relationships with lies, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "In Navajo, Shimasani is listening." And something about those words, the sound of them, the particular gentleness and steadiness of her voice, broke open the thing in my chest that I had been holding closed for years, and I cried on my kitchen floor for a very long time while my grandmother stayed on the phone and breathed steadily and did not rush me or offer false comfort or tell me it was going to be okay before she had reason to believe that it was. When I was done, she said, "Come see me this weekend, and don't tell your father." I went to see her, and that visit was the beginning of the end of the life my parents had been building for me without my consent, and the beginning, slow and careful and ultimately irrevocable, of my own. To understand my parents, I have to tell you about the community I grew up in. Not as an excuse, nothing that follows functions as an excuse, but as a context, because context matters. And because flattening this story into a simple tale of bad people doing bad things would be a disservice to the complicated truth. My father, Raymond Runningwater, was a respected man. He served on the chapter house board for 12 years. He was involved in water rights negotiations that benefited the community in real and lasting ways. He coached youth basketball for a decade. He was, by most external measures, a good man. He was also a man who had grown up in a culture of fierce family loyalty that had, somewhere along the way, curdled in him into something controlling. Who believed, genuinely and without apparent irony, that his primary role as a father was to determine the trajectory of his children's lives and then enforce that trajectory through whatever means were available. My mother, Sandra, was softer in presentation and harder in execution. She had wanted, all her life, to be the kind of woman other women came to for guidance. She had that in our family. She was the one who organized gatherings, mediated disputes, maintained relationships across extended family networks. She was good at that. The problem was that she applied the same organizing intelligence to my life that she applied to community logistics, and she was not capable of distinguishing between the two. My choices were not, to her, my choices. They were variables in a larger plan that she was managing. My brother, Kevin, was 4 years older than me and had followed the path without apparent conflict. He married a woman our parents approved of, settled in a town nearby, worked in tribal administration. I loved my brother. I want to be clear about that. Kevin was not cruel. He simply hadn't been asked to be anything other than what he was. The pressure that had been placed on me, the specific, a gendered pressure around marriage and proximity and compliance, had not been placed on him in the same way. He saw what was happening in our family the way you see something in your peripheral vision, aware of it, but not quite willing to turn and look directly. And then there was me. I was the younger child, the daughter, the one who had gone to college at Northern Arizona University and studied environmental science. The one who had returned to the reservation not because she was pulled back by obligation, but because she genuinely loved the land and wanted to work on issues that mattered to the community. I was the one who had opinions about everything, who read too much, who asked questions at chapter house meetings that my father found embarrassing, who had, at various points in my 20s, dated men from different backgrounds, different clans, different communities, not to rebel, but simply because those were the people I met and felt something real with. That was the thing my parents could not accept. Not who I dated specifically, though they had opinions about each man in exhausting detail, but the fact that I was dating at all, that I was choosing for myself, that I was constructing a private life with its own interior logic that did not root through them. They wanted to be the switchboard. Every relationship, every decision, every significant life event had to pass through them before it could be real. And when I built things that bypassed that switchboard, they destroyed them. I didn't understand this clearly until much later. For years, I understood it only as pain. As a series of relationships that ended mysteriously. As a reputation I couldn't account for. As a growing conviction, carefully cultivated by my parents through years of small comments and strategic comparisons, that I was too much, too difficult, too independent for anyone to stay with. I was 26 when the therapy started. Dr. Morales's office was in Farmington, a 40-minute drive, and I went every 2 weeks for 8 months. She was a good therapist, patient, specific, resistant to easy explanations. She helped me understand that the story I had been telling myself, that there was something fundamentally unlovable about me. Some quality that drove people away, was not a truth I had discovered, but a lie I had been handed and then internalized so completely that I had started generating evidence for it. What we didn't know, in those sessions, was the full scope of what my parents were doing. We suspected family enmeshment. We discussed my difficulty trusting partners, my tendency to wait for relationships to fall apart rather than investing fully. We did good, real work. But we were building a house without knowing the full foundation plan, and so there were load-bearing walls we couldn't see. It was during this period that my father sent the text message that I have kept, that I have read hundreds of times, that eventually became one of the most important pieces of evidence in a legal proceeding my parents never imagined I would bring. The message said, and I am reciting this from memory, but I have the screenshots to prove every word. Lena. Dale is a good man with a stable future. His family is respected. You are not getting younger and your choices are hurting this family. Marry Dale or we will not stop doing what we are doing. This is not a threat. This is the truth. We will not stop doing what we are doing. He had, in that moment, admitted it. Not to a third party. Not in a conversation that could be disputed. In a text message from his personal phone, to my personal phone, because he was so confident in his control over the situation, so certain that I would understand the implied threat and comply, or that I would be too ashamed or afraid to do anything with the evidence, that he had committed his cruelty to writing without a moment's hesitation. I screenshot that message before I had consciously decided what I was going to do with it. Some part of me that was already planning, already preparing, I'd already building the quiet case. That part moved faster than my conscious mind and saved the message in 3 different places before my hands had stopped shaking. I called my grandmother again that night, I read her the message over the phone. She was quiet for even longer than the first time. Then she said, "Why, I need to tell you something about your grandmother's land." Let me tell you about Evelyn Runningwater. She was born in 1945 on land that her mother had held since before there were formal systems for recording such holdings. The house she lived in had been built in stages, started by her mother, expanded by her father, added to over decades as the family grew and the resources allowed. The land itself was complicated. Not as land on the Navajo Nation is often complicated, a combination of allotted land, assigned use rights, yes, and one piece, about 40 acres in the northeastern corner, that her mother had purchased outright in 1962 through a land transaction that a Bureau of Indian Affairs agent had attempted to obstruct, and that my great-grandmother had completed anyway through a combination of legal savvy and what my grandmother described only as patience and stubbornness. My grandmother had never married again after my grandfather died. She had 2 children, my father, Raymond, and a daughter named Patricia, who had moved to Phoenix in 1990, and with whom my grandmother maintained a warm and frequent correspondence. Patricia, Aunt Pat to me, had not returned to the reservation to live, but she had never been erased from my grandmother's world the way that physical distance sometimes erases people from family networks. What my grandmother told me that night, on the phone, after I read her my father's text message, was this: she had a lawyer. She had had a lawyer for 6 years. Not the kind of lawyer you call when something goes wrong, the kind you retain for the long term, the kind you build a relationship with, the kind who drafts documents and reviews them and updates them as circumstances change. A woman named Sarah Begay, who worked out of a firm in Window Rock and who had, over the course of their long professional relationship, helped my grandmother do a number of things that nobody in our family, not my father, not Aunt Pat, certainly not me, had any idea about. My grandmother had drafted a new will in 2017. She had placed 40 acres of the northeastern land into a trust in 2018. She had, in the course of the last 6 years, quietly and methodically reorganized her modest but real assets in ways that protected them from the kind of informal family pressure that she had watched operate on the Navajo Nation her entire life. The pressure where the patriarch of one generation assumed control of the grandmother's assets without formal process. Where resources flowed according to who was physically present and socially dominant rather than according to any principled plan. She had done all of this alone. She had told no one. She had watched my father, her own son, assume, gradually and with increasing confidence, that her assets would pass to him in the natural course of things, because he was the elder child, because he was male, because he lived nearby, because he managed her affairs in the informal sense of driving her to appointments and handling paperwork she found tedious. She had let him assume. She had been waiting. "I am telling you this now," my grandmother said, "because I think it is time. I am 78 years old. My knees are worse. I want to know that when I am gone, certain things go to you. And I want you to know that now, so you understand what is possible, so you don't give up." She paused. "And because what your father is doing is wrong, and he needs to face it. And I think, with the right help, you can make sure that happens." I sat with what she had told me for a long time that night. I sat with it the way you sit with something very large and very unexpected, the way you might sit with a landscape that is different from what you anticipated. Not bad, just different. Requiring a recalibration of everything you thought you were navigating. My grandmother, in her quiet, deliberate, unhurried way, had been planning for this. Not this specifically. She couldn't have predicted the exact shape of my situation. But she had been planning for the possibility that her son's controlling tendencies would eventually require a counterweight. She had been building that counterweight for 6 years. The next day, I made an appointment with Sarah Begay. Sarah Begay was 44 years old, Diné, To Dicini clan, and she ran her office with the particular organized calm of someone who had spent decades watching families in crisis and had developed an immunity to chaos that read, from the outside, as serenity. Her office had windows that looked out on the Chuska Mountains and a small painting on the east wall that I would later learn her mother had made. She shook my hand when I arrived and looked at me the way people look at you when they are actually paying attention rather than simply making eye contact. I told her everything. I told her about Marcus and Jerome and Cody. I told her about my mother's calls, my father's calls. I told her about the years of erosion, the therapy, the growing comprehension of what had been done to me. I showed her the text message. She read it twice. Then she said, "Are there other messages?" I said yes. Years of messages, many of which I had saved without knowing exactly why. Messages from my father about my choices. Messages from my mother expressing concern about my behavior. Messages from my father that referenced, obliquely or sometimes directly, the men I was dating and his opinion of them. She said, "And the men themselves, Marcus, Jerome, Cody, do you think they would be willing to speak to what they were told?" I said I didn't know. I said I had lost contact with Marcus years ago. I said Jerome and I had no relationship. I said Cody, who had been honest with me, might be willing. She said, "Let me explain what we're working with legally." What she explained over the next hour and a half was a framework I had never considered. Well, because I had never had reason to think about my situation as a legal matter. I had thought of it as a family matter, a personal matter, a psychological matter. But what my parents had done, the deliberate, repeated, coordinated communication of false medical information to the partners I was seeing with the intent to damage those relationships, had legal dimensions, defamation, tortious interference with personal relationships. In the text message, something approaching extortion, or at minimum coercion, the explicit conditioning of stopping harmful behavior on my compliance with a demand. "I want to be honest with you," Sarah said. "Cases like this are difficult. Defamation is always difficult to prove, especially when the communications were private between your parents and individuals who may or may not be willing to testify. But you have something that most people in your situation don't have." She held up her phone, where I had shown her the screenshot. "You have him admitting it in writing." She let that sit for a moment. That changes things considerably. What happened over the next 8 months was not dramatic. I want to be honest about that. Because I think when we tell these stories, the stories of people who were wronged and then found a way to seek justice, we sometimes compress the timeline and smooth the texture until it looks like a series of clean, decisive moments. It wasn't. It was slow and often discouraging, and there were many nights when I called my grandmother and said that I wasn't sure I could do this, and she would listen and then ask me one practical question. "Have you sent Sarah the documents she asked for? Or did you call Jerome back?" That pulled me out of the swirling uncertainty and back into the immediate, manageable task. Jerome, it turned out, was willing to talk. He had felt guilty for years about how things ended between us. When I called him, a conversation I rehearsed for 3 days, he was quiet for a long time and then said, "I figured it out eventually. You know, that something wasn't right about that call. I just didn't know what to do with it." He gave a statement to Sarah's office. Cody had already said he would help with anything he could. Marcus. I found Marcus through a mutual friend, hesitantly, months into the process, was in a different place. He was married now, living in Albuquerque, and hearing from me clearly stirred up complicated things for him. He did not want to give a formal statement. He did write me a letter, handwritten. That acknowledged what my father had told him and expressed something between an apology and an explanation. I kept the letter. We decided, after consultation with Sarah, not to push him further. 2 witnesses were sufficient, especially with the text message. Meanwhile, my grandmother's legal situation became relevant in a different way. My father had, it turned out, been making informal representations to people in the community, and once, in a meeting about chapter house business, Sas in a more formal context about his expectations regarding her property. He had spoken to a cousin about plans to consolidate certain family land holdings. He had had a conversation with the friend whose son he wanted me to marry, Dale Whitehorse's father, that included references to land that would be coming to the family in the normal course of things. None of this was legally actionable on its own, but it was a pattern. It was documentation of an assumption that my grandmother's I executed legal work had already made obsolete. And it spoke, Sarah explained to me, to motive. To the broader context in which my parents' interference in my relationships made a particular kind of sense. I was supposed to marry Dale Whitehorse not simply because they liked Dale Whitehorse or his family, but because a marriage between me and Dale would cement a particular set of family alliances, social expectations, and, more specifically, management assumptions about land and resources that my father had been quietly building toward for years. My compliance was not just about control, it was about assets. My grandmother, who had watched all of this unfold from her house outside Sileith with the patience of someone who had grown up in a landscape that teaches patience. I confirmed this when I asked her about it directly. "Your father believes he understands the future," she said. "He has been planning it for a long time. What he does not understand is that other people have also been planning." I asked her if she felt guilty, withholding this from him. She considered this seriously, the way she considered everything seriously. "I kept my own counsel about my own property," she said. "I owe no one an explanation for that. Your father assumed without asking. That is his error, not mine." She was quiet for a moment. "But I am not doing this to hurt him. I am doing this to protect you. And because what he is doing to you is wrong. And he should know that I know that, and that I have always known that, and that there are consequences. I want to tell you about Dale Whitehorse, because he deserves more than a supporting role in this narrative. I had known Dale my whole life. He was 10 years older than me, which meant he had been a teenager when I was in elementary school, an adult when I was learning to drive. He was a large, quiet man with a tendency to stand slightly apart at family gatherings, holding a drink and watching without participating. I had always read that as shyness. Later, I understood it as the particular careful self-management of someone who is trying to control how much he reveals. Dale drank. Not dramatically, not in the way that makes headlines or requires intervention or becomes a family crisis. Steadily, quietly, consistently. A kind of drinking that functions for years as a system rather than a problem. As long as no one looks too closely, he was not cruel. I want to be clear about that. Dale Whitehorse was not a villain. He was a man who had his own situation, his own struggles, his own set of family expectations that he had not chosen and was not entirely capable of navigating. The marriage his father and my father envisioned would not have been good for him either. Though in different ways. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that what I was resisting was not Dale specifically. It was the principle that my life was a variable to be optimized in someone else's plan, the principle that my consent was a formality that my parents had already dispensed with, the principle that the person I was, curious, independent, genuinely invested in building my own future, was less important than the role I was supposed to perform. About 5 months into the legal process, my father called me. He called on a Thursday evening, which was unusual. We had not spoken in several weeks. I had been managing distance carefully, not going silent entirely because that would have alarmed him and potentially accelerated his actions, but limiting contact to brief, surface-level exchanges that gave him nothing to respond to. The call felt deliberate. He had, I thought, been watching the distance and deciding to address it. He asked how I was. I said fine. He asked about work. I was working at the time for the Tribal Environmental Department, monitoring water quality in a region where coal mining had created complex contamination questions. I gave him a brief, factual answer. He said that sounded important. Then he said, Dale is going to be at the Yazzie gathering next month. I thought you should know. I said I had heard. I would probably see him there. He said, Lena, I want you to think seriously about this. He's a good man. His family is solid. I know you have your ideas about doing things on your own, but there's strength in the right partnership. This could be good for all of us. I said, including the land? There was a pause. Not long. Brief enough that if I hadn't been listening very carefully, I might have missed its significance. He said, What does that mean? I said, Just that I understand there's a lot involved in this conversation that we're not talking about directly. I think we should talk about it directly sometime. Another pause. He said, Everything I do is for this family. I said, I know you believe that. And I ended the call. I sat very still for a few minutes afterward. In the environmental department office, where I was still sitting at my desk at 6:30 in the evening, surrounded by water quality reports and GIS maps of a landscape that had been exploited and was slowly, with a lot of effort, being partially restored. I thought about what it means to believe something sincerely and be completely wrong. I thought about my father, who genuinely believed that what he was doing was for the family. Who would have been unable, I think, to articulate the difference between what was good for the family and what was good for his vision of the family, which was a very different thing. I sent Sarah a message and told her about the call. She said, Good. Keep records of everything. We're almost ready. The week before Thanksgiving of that year, Sarah filed. It was not a criminal complaint. She had been clear from early in our conversations that we were likely in civil territory, that the bar for criminal charges around defamation and coercion was high, and that the facts, while compelling, were most clearly actionable in a civil framework. What she filed was a civil complaint alleging defamation and tortious interference with prospective relationships, and naming both my father and my mother as defendants. The complaint included the text message. It included statements from Jerome and Cody, both of whom had provided detailed accounts of what they had been told and by whom. It included a summary of the pattern of behavior stretching back to Marcus, which, while not proven by direct testimony from Marcus, was corroborated by other evidence and consistent with the established pattern. It included a section on damages that addressed not just the specific relationships that had been destroyed, but the broader impact. The years of therapy. The professional disruption I had experienced during periods of emotional crisis. The cumulative effect on my quality of life. My father received the papers on a Wednesday, my mother on the same day. I know the exact moment because my brother Kevin called me 20 minutes after they were served. He said, Lena, what is this? I had thought about this call. I had rehearsed it, in a way. Though not the specific words, just the posture, the steadiness I wanted to maintain. I said, It's a lawsuit, Kevin. He said, Against Mom and Dad. I said, Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Why didn't you come to me first? Why didn't you talk to me? I said, What would you have done? He didn't answer. Not because he was being evasive. I don't think Kevin was capable of evasion, not at his core, but because he genuinely didn't know. And we both understood, in that silence, that there was an honest answer there, and it wasn't the one that would have helped me. I said, Kevin, I am telling you now. I am not asking you to choose sides. I am asking you to listen, if you want to listen. I will tell you everything. But I need you to understand that I have been trying to have a life, and I have been prevented from having a life by Mom and Dad, us for years, and I can't let that continue. He said, Lena, I said, Jerome Running Water, Marcus Tso, Cody Benally, Dad called all of them. He told them I had a virus. Do you understand what I'm saying? He told them I had herpes. Those words, Kevin, those exact words. And Mom called too. And they have been doing this every time I started seeing someone. The silence was very long this time. He said, finally, I didn't know. I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "I'm sorry." "Lena." And I believed him. Kevin's culpability in this story is the culpability of someone who looked away, not the same as someone who looked and chose to participate. I was angry at him, for a time, and then I was not, because I understood that the family I had been raised in had given him very little practice in looking at difficult things directly. My parents hired a lawyer immediately. His name was Gerald Moretti, a man who worked out of Farmington and had some experience with tribal jurisdiction questions, though Sarah was more expert in that terrain and he knew it. The initial response from Moretti, conveyed through formal channels, was what Sarah had predicted, a combination of denial and counter-narrative. My parents had called the men in my life out of concern. They were expressing parental care. The information they shared was based on genuine belief and was not intended to damage. The text message, which was the hardest evidence to explain away, was characterized as the frustrated expression of parental worry rather than a threat or an admission. Sarah read me the response in her office, and I watched her face while she did it. Her expression did not change. When she finished, she set the papers down and said, "This is a predictable response. It is not a strong one." She explained why. The text message was not ambiguous. "We will not stop doing what we are doing." There was no interpretation of those words that resolved into innocent parental concern. The pattern, 3 documented instances with 2 witness statements, was not consistent with misguided care. And crucially, the specific false information my parents had communicated, a medical condition, herpes specifically, was not the kind of thing you share in good faith. It was targeted. It was designed to produce a specific outcome. It was not a parent expressing worry about a daughter's choices. It was a targeted campaign to make me unmarriageable outside of their chosen option. The case moved through its early procedural stages over the winter and into the spring. There was a deposition period during which Jerome and Cody gave formal statements. There was a deposition of my father, which Sarah attended with me, and which I sat through in a condition of absolute stillness, while my father, in the same calm, authoritative voice he used for everything, gave answers that were technically careful and substantively dishonest. He had called the men to share concerns. He had misunderstood information about my health. He had only wanted to protect his daughter. Sarah cross-examined him for 2 hours. I watched her work. She went through the timeline systematically, establishing dates, establishing who made each call, establishing that the same specific medical claim, herpes, a sexually transmitted infection, something that would alarm a potential partner and create immediate distance, had been communicated in each instance. She established that my father had no medical information about me and no source for this claim. She established that the claim was false, which he eventually had to acknowledge in the careful language of someone trying to hedge, because he had no evidence to offer. Then she showed him the text message and asked him to read it aloud. He read it. She asked him to explain what he meant by, "We will not stop doing what we are doing." He said he had meant that they would continue to share their concerns about her choices. She asked if sharing concerns about her choices included calling her romantic partners and claiming she had a sexually transmitted infection. He said he had been worried. She asked, "Worried about what? Specifically?" He said, about her making choices that would harm the family. She asked, "What choices, specifically?" He paused. She waited. He said, "Choices about who she associated with." She asked, "And was it the family's position that it had the right to determine who their adult daughter associated with through means including false representations of her medical history?" His lawyer objected. There was a discussion. The question was eventually answered, in a form that attempted to be non-responsive, but that the record would reflect. I sat through all of it in absolute stillness. After, in the parking lot, I stood by Sarah's car in the spring wind and felt something I could not immediately name. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter and more fundamental. Something like the experience of having your own experience confirmed, of having someone else's careful, relentless. My evidence-based examination arrive at the same truth you have been living with for years and say it in front of witnesses and put it in a record. My grandmother came to Farmington for one day during the mediation period. She had not traveled much in recent years. Her knees made long car rides uncomfortable, and she had arranged her life, over the years since my grandfather died, so that most of what she needed came to her or was accessible nearby. Coming to Farmington required my Aunt Pat to drive up from Phoenix, and the two of them arrived on a Tuesday morning in April in Aunt Pat's sensible silver SUV. And my grandmother walked into the mediation facility with her cane and her dignity and sat down across a table from my father, her son, and looked at him with an expression I will spend the rest of my life trying to accurately describe. She had not told him she was coming. She had not told anyone except me and Sarah. My father's expression when she walked in was one of the most complex things I have ever seen on a human face. It was composed, in the span of about 3 seconds, of surprise and something like shame and something like anger and something like the specific fear of a person who realizes that an authority they did not expect is present and paying attention. My grandmother sat down. Aunt Pat sat beside her. I sat across from my parents. Sarah sat beside me. My grandmother did not speak for almost a full minute. She looked at my father. My father looked at the table. Then she said, in Navajo, was something that I will translate approximately but cannot fully convey. I taught you what is right. You knew the difference. You chose. My father did not respond. She said in English, for the record, what you have done to your daughter is wrong. I know what you have done. I have known for years. I said nothing because I was giving you the opportunity to stop. You did not stop. You sent her a message telling her to marry the man you chose or you would continue to hurt her. You put that in writing. I raised you to know better than this. My father said very quietly, Mother, she said no. Just that word, no. The mediation that day did not fully resolve the case, but it shifted something. I could see it in my father's lawyer, in the careful recalibration of his posture and his notes. I could see it in my mother, who had barely spoken in any of the proceedings, and who, when my grandmother turned to look at her, closed her eyes briefly. And I could see it, most importantly, in my father, who was, for the first time in my life that I could remember, actually small. Not diminished by me, not diminished by the law, me specifically. Diminished by the judgment of the person whose judgment he had always, at some level, needed, his mother, sitting across from him with her cane and her clarity and her absolute refusal to pretend that what he had done was acceptable. The settlement was reached 6 weeks later. I am not going to give you the specific numbers because the settlement included a confidentiality provision around the financial terms, and I am honoring that provision. What I can tell you is that what was acknowledged in the formal language of legal documents was sufficient. My parents did not admit wrongdoing. Settlements almost never include formal admissions, but the terms of the agreement and the financial consequence constituted an acknowledgement that carried its own weight. Part of the agreement required them to cease all contact with any current or future romantic partners of mine. It required them to refrain from sharing any medical or personal information about me with third parties without my explicit consent. It included provisions for my attorney's fees, and it was enforceable. I sat in Sarah's office after I signed the documents and looked out at the Chuska Mountains and felt the particular quality of silence that follows the end of a very long and effortful thing. Sarah said, "How are you?" I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "That's honest." She said, "You should know that this was not a simple case. A lot of people in your situation don't get here. You got here because you kept records. You had the text message. You were willing to talk to people who had been hurt by the same thing and ask them to tell their truth. And you had your grandmother." I said, "I had a lot of help." Boss said, "You also did a lot of work." I thought about that, about the months of documentation, of carefully maintained records, of conversations I had steeled myself to have, about the therapy that had given me just enough structural integrity to withstand what the process required, about the late nights on my kitchen floor and the calls to my grandmother and the slow, grinding accumulation of something that had started as survival and eventually became strategy. She was right. I had done a lot of work. My grandmother's will, when it was executed 2 years later, she lived to 81, dying on a spring morning in the house her mother had built, surrounded by her rugs and her sheep and the desert light she had watched for 8 decades, left the 40 acres of northeastern land to me. It left the house and its contents to both me and Aunt Pat in equal shares. It left my father a letter that none of us have read. She sealed it and addressed it to him, and Sarah delivered it with the other estate documents, and whatever it says, it is between him and her. She also left me a small box that I had never seen before, a cedar box painted with a traditional design that I recognized as her mother's work. Inside the box was a photograph I had never seen, a young woman standing in front of the house before it was fully completed, maybe 1940 or 1941, squinting into bright sun. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting that was not my grandmother's, were words in Navajo that translate approximately, "Oyaz, she builds what she needs. She keeps what matters. She does not wait for permission." Underneath the photograph was a piece of paper, folded once. It was the deed to the 40 acres with my name already on it. She had had it changed before she died. She had already transferred it. She had known she was running out of time, and she had made sure I would not have to wait for the legal process to work. She had simply given it to me. I held that deed in my hands for a long time. Alone in her house, which smelled of wool and juniper and the particular dry sweetness of old wood in high desert air. The sheep were quiet outside. The light was coming through the east window the way she had always said it should come, slow and horizontal and full of information. I thought about what it means to plan for someone. Not to plan their life, the way my father had planned mine. Not to plot the trajectory and enforce it and punish deviation, but to plan for someone, to see who they are and what they need and quietly, over years, assemble the conditions that might allow them to flourish, to trust them with something real and say, not in words but in the clear language of a legal document, "I believe you can hold this." She had believed I could hold this. For years, before I believed it myself, she had been acting on that belief. My life now is not dramatic in ways that make good stories. It is good in quieter ways. I still work in environmental science. I moved, about a year after the settlement, to a position with a regional organization that works on water rights and land use across several tribal nations, which means I travel more than I used to. Window Rock to Albuquerque to Phoenix and back, occasional trips to Washington to meet with federal agencies and explain, patiently and repeatedly, why the frameworks they are operating with do not reflect the realities on the ground. It is frustrating and important work, the kind where progress is measured in years and occasionally in generations. I live in a small house in Chinle that I am renting while I figure out what to do with the 40 acres. There are ideas. My cousin, who has always wanted to start a small agricultural project, has been talking to me about it. I am thinking, I am not rushing. I am in a relationship. I am not going to tell you much about him because he is a private person and his story is not mine to tell, but I will say that he is patient and funny and deeply interested in things, the way some people are just structurally curious about everything, always pulling threads, always asking the next question, and that what I felt with him, early on, was not the cautious, self-protective holding back that had characterized every relationship I tried to have during the years my parents were sabotaging them. I felt, from relatively early, something that I would describe as trust. Not the easy trust of someone who has never been hurt. The harder, more deliberate trust of someone who has learned to tell the difference between a foundation that will hold and one that won't. I told him the full story about 6 months in. I sat him down, warned him it was long. I made tea and talked for almost 3 hours. He listened the whole time without interrupting. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The text message, you saved it in 3 places?" I said yes. He said, "That's the part that gets me, that in the middle of everything some part of you already knew." I thought about that for a long time afterward. Some part of me already knew. Some part of me that had been watching the pattern accumulate. That had been registering the evidence before my conscious mind was ready to name it, that had moved my hands to save that message before I had decided what to do with it. I think that part of me had been listening to my grandmother's advice long before she gave it explicitly. I think growing up watching her, the way she moved through the world with deliberate attention, the way she made decisions slowly and kept her own counsel and trusted her own assessment of what was real, had deposited something in me that survived even the years of erosion. That the story my parents tried to write about me, unlovable, unreliable, medically compromised, is too difficult to be chosen, had never completely overwritten the story my grandmother had been quietly telling, the one where I was capable, the one where I was worth building for. My brother Kevin and I have repaired most of what was damaged in our relationship, though repair is maybe not the right word. Transformed is closer. We are closer now than we were before all of this, which is strange and also makes sense. The conversations we have now are more honest than any conversations we had growing up, because we have both been through something that required honesty and learned, on the other side of it, that honesty is not as dangerous as we were raised to believe. He knows the full story. He struggled with it, struggled with loving his parents and understanding what they had done, which is a genuinely difficult thing, and I do not minimize that difficulty. He has his own relationship with them now, separate from mine, which is as it should be. My relationship with my parents is what I would describe as formal. We exchange information about health and family events. I attend certain gatherings. I do not pretend that what happened between us did not happen. I also do not carry it as an active wound, which took longer to achieve than any external legal resolution. That came from therapy, which I returned to after the settlement, and from time, and from the 40 acres that sit in my name and remind me, without words, that I was worth planning for. My father has never spoken to me directly about what was in my grandmother's letter to him. I don't expect he will. He is a man who has always preferred the architecture of dignity to the exposure of accountability. And I have made my peace with that preference because I do not require his acknowledgement to know what happened. My mother sent me a card at the holidays this past year. It was a simple card with a winter landscape on the front, and inside she had written, "Lena, I think about things. I love you." That was all. I kept the card. I want to close by talking about what I think this story is actually about, because I have been telling it for a while now, and I want to make sure I am being precise. It is easy to tell this as a revenge story, to focus on the settlement, on my father's expression in the mediation room, on the legal documents that said, "You did this and there are consequences." And those things are real. I am not going to pretend the legal outcome was not satisfying, because it was, not in a triumphant way, but in the way that any accurate accounting is satisfying. When what is true finally gets named as true, in a forum that has the weight to make it matter, there is something that settles. But I don't think that's what the story is about. I think the story is about my grandmother, and about what she understood that my father did not. She understood that control is not the same as love, that managing someone's life, even with genuine care, or even with sincere belief that you know what's best, is not the same as supporting them. She understood that the most meaningful thing you can do for a person you love is to trust them, to see who they actually are, not who you need them to be, and to build toward that person's flourishing rather than your own vision of their flourishing. She could have intervened earlier. She could have confronted my father directly years before I ever called her on my kitchen floor. But she understood something about timing and about readiness that I only understand now in retrospect. She was waiting for me to be ready. She was waiting for me to arrive at the moment where I could hold what she had been building. Because the 40 acres, the trust, the lawyer, the carefully organized estate, those were not just legal instruments. They were a declaration of faith in a specific person, and faith requires the person to be present to receive it. I think about the women in my family who preceded me. My great-grandmother, who completed a land transaction in 1962 that a federal agent tried to obstruct through patience and stubbornness. My grandmother, who watched and planned and kept her own counsel for 8 decades. The line of people who held this land through circumstances that were not designed to support their holding it, who maintained things for the next person without being certain the next person was ready or who the next person would be. I am the next person, and I intend to hold it. If you are listening to this and you recognize something in it, if you are somewhere in the middle of a situation where the people who should be protecting you are the source of the harm, where you feel like the story being told about you is not the story you recognize as true, I want to say something directly to you. Document everything. Text messages, voicemails, dates and times, and what was said by whom. Not because you necessarily know what you're going to do with it, because the record is a form of respect that you give yourself. Is a way of insisting on the truth of your own experience before you know what truth requires of you. Find one person. Not many people. One. Someone who sees clearly and keeps confidences and will say the thing that is actually true rather than the thing that makes the situation more comfortable. That person might surprise you. My grandmother surprised me. She had been building toward me for 6 years before I knew to ask. And understand that the people who are harming you are often not acting from malice alone. They are often acting from fear, from need, from a version of love that has been so badly distorted by control that it has become its opposite. That is not an excuse. It is not a reason to stay in the situation or to accept what is being done to you. But it is worth understanding, because understanding it means you do not have to become its mirror. You do not have to become someone who destroys in return. You can build a case. You can document the truth. You can work with people who know how to make the truth legible. And you can leave the space between what you were given and what you choose to do with it as clean as you can make it. My grandmother did not hate my father. She held him accountable. Those are not the same thing. I am trying to learn the difference. Every day I am trying. The land is there under the sky, patient and real, and it is mine to hold, and I am learning to hold it. And that is enough for now. That is more than enough. That is everything. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever had to fight to be seen clearly by the people who were supposed to see you best, I would love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location below. And if someone in your life needs to hear that their experience is real and their case can be made and someone is building toward them even when they can't see it yet, share this. That's the whole point. That's always been the whole point.